In the spring of 1944, at a Luftwaffe airfield somewhere in central Germany, a man with 206 aerial victories climbed into the cockpit of an enemy aircraft and felt, for the first time in years, something he had not expected to feel: uncertainty. Major Heinrich Erler was 30 years old. He had been flying combat missions since the opening weeks of the war. He had fought over Norway, over the Arctic convoy routes, over the Eastern Front, over the Reich itself, as Allied bombers began arriving in numbers that nobody in the Luftwaffe High Command had predicted with sufficient seriousness. He had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He had been investigated, court-martialed, and acquitted in a political proceeding that had more to do with finding someone to blame for a strategic failure than with anything Erler had actually done wrong. He was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. None of that experience had prepared him for what he found when he settled into the cockpit of the North American P-51 Mustang. The aircraft had been recovered from a crash landing in occupied territory, repaired by German mechanics who understood precisely what they were working on and why, and assigned to a unit whose existence the Luftwaffe High Command considered one of the more valuable intelligence assets of the air war. The unit flew captured Allied aircraft. It toured operational airfields across the Reich, demonstrating enemy machines to frontline pilots, teaching the men who would have to fight these aircraft what those aircraft could and could not do. If you were going to survive against a machine you had never flown, the theory went, the best preparation was to fly it yourself. Erler had been summoned because the High Command wanted assessments from pilots whose opinions could not be dismissed. A junior officer's evaluation of a captured aircraft was interesting. An evaluation from a man with 200 victories was authoritative. What Erler found in that cockpit, and what he reported to his superiors, told a story about the air war over Germany in 1944 that went far beyond the technical specifications of a single aircraft. The story begins with the problem the P-51 was created to solve, because understanding the problem makes the solution comprehensible in its full dimensions. In the summer and autumn of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had been attempting to destroy German industrial capacity through strategic bombing. The theory was straightforward. Germany's war machine depended on specific industrial nodes: ball bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft manufacturing facilities. Destroy those nodes and the machine would stop. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force were the instruments of that destruction. The theory encountered reality in the form of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, which was waiting at the German border every time the bombers crossed it. American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that accompanied the bombers, could reach the German frontier and no further. Their fuel tanks were too small. The moment the escorts turned back, the German fighters attacked, and they attacked with the efficiency of men who had been fighting and learning from fighting for 4 years. The losses were catastrophic. On the 14th of October, 1943, 60 American heavy bombers failed to return from a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The 8th Air Force had lost roughly 26% of the aircraft it sent to that target. Losses at that rate were mathematically unsustainable. If the bombing campaign continued at that cost, it would destroy itself before it destroyed Germany. The American response to this crisis was already in development when Black Thursday happened, but the crisis accelerated the timeline. The P-51 Mustang, which had been designed for the British and had demonstrated extraordinary range characteristics once engineers replaced its original engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, was the answer. With 2 external drop tanks, A P-51 could accompany bombers from English airfields to targets anywhere in Germany and return. The escorts would not turn back at the German border. They would fly all the way to the target, engage the Luftwaffe fighters over their own airfields, and fly all the way home. This was the aircraft that Heinrich Oehler was asked to evaluate, not as an abstraction. As a machine he would climb into, fly, push to its limits, and report on with the authority of a man who had spent 5 years learning what mattered in an aircraft when someone was trying to kill you. His first impression was the cockpit, and the cockpit told him something immediately. The Bf-109, which Oehler had flown for most of his combat career, was a small aircraft in every dimension. The fuselage was narrow. The cockpit was tight. Sitting in a Bf-109, a pilot's shoulders were close to the canopy rails. The instrument panel was within easy reach. The controls fell naturally to hand, and the entire environment communicated a kind of concentrated intimacy. Everything close, everything responsive, everything where years of muscle memory expected it to be. The P-51 was different in a way that was difficult to describe without flying both aircraft. The cockpit was larger. The instrument panel was further away. The controls required a slightly longer reach. None of this was a flaw in the American design. It was a deliberate choice that reflected a different philosophy about what a fighter pilot needed to do his job. But for a man whose reflexes had been calibrated to the Bf-109 over thousands of hours of flight, the P-51's cockpit was initially disorienting in a way that he had not anticipated. More important than the size was the visibility. The P-51D, the variant that Oehler was evaluating, featured a bubble canopy that provided a 360-degree view of the surrounding sky with no structural obstruction above the pilot's eye line. The Bf-109's canopy had significant framing that created blind spots, and the brace running down the center of the rear transparency reduced rearward visibility further. In a combat environment where being seen before you saw was a death sentence, the P-51's visibility advantage was not a minor convenience. It was a tactical asset of the first order. Oehler had been ambushed. Most fighter pilots who had flown enough missions had been ambushed. The aircraft you never saw was the one that killed you, and the canopy that let you see further and more completely was the canopy that kept you alive. Sitting in the P-51's cockpit and looking around, he understood immediately that American pilots in this aircraft had an awareness advantage over anyone flying against them in a Bf-109 or an FW-190. Then he started the engine, and the engine changed everything. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the P-51D was a different kind of engineering achievement from the Daimler-Benz DB605 that powered the Bf-109G. Both were liquid-cooled V12 engines producing roughly comparable peak power figures. The differences were in the details, and the details were what Oehler noticed when the Merlin came to life and he began working through the power checks before taxiing. The Merlin started with a button, not a procedure, not a sequence of manually operated steps that a ground crew member had to assist with. A button. American electrical starting systems had eliminated the hand-cranked inertia starter that German ground crews had to operate in all weather conditions, including the temperatures on the Eastern Front that dropped well below anything compatible with human comfort or mechanical reliability. In a Russian winter, starting a Bf-109 required men with tools working in conditions that froze the lubricant in the engine and made every component stiff and reluctant. The P-51 required a button press. This was not a minor detail to a man who had spent time on the Eastern Front. Operational readiness in that theater was a constant struggle against cold and mechanical failure and the logistics of keeping machines functional at the end of supply lines that the Soviet winter made precarious. An aircraft that simplified its own starting procedure was an aircraft that would be ready to fly more often in worse conditions with fewer men and fewer minutes between the order and the wheels leaving the ground. The engine ran cleanly. No oil weeping from the cowling seams. No irregular vibration through the airframe that suggested something working harder than it should. The Merlin at idle had a sound and a smoothness that communicated, in the physical language that engines speak to pilots who have spent years listening to them, that everything inside it was where it was supposed to be and doing what it was supposed to do. Erler had flown aircraft with engines that did not communicate this. He had flown aircraft where the idle note carried undertones that experienced ears heard as warning. The Bf-109, which was an excellent aircraft in many respects, had an engine that required constant attention from its ground crews and that reflected, in its maintenance requirements, the reality of German manufacturing under wartime conditions. The Merlin, built on American production lines to tolerances that American industrial capacity could sustain even under the pressure of wartime output, communicated a different kind of reliability. He taxied out and took off, and the takeoff told him something else. The Bf-109 was a demanding aircraft to take off in. Its narrow undercarriage, set close together on a track that would have been considered too narrow on most other aircraft, required precise rudder management during the takeoff roll to prevent the aircraft from swinging and departing the runway in ways that ranged from embarrassing to fatal. The list of Bf-109 losses attributable to takeoff and landing accidents was long enough to constitute a meaningful percentage of total aircraft losses, and the pilots who had bent or destroyed Bf-109s on the ground included experienced men who simply encountered an aircraft that punished imprecision at low speed. The P-51 was more forgiving. Its wider undercarriage was stable. The takeoff roll was straightforward. The aircraft climbed away without the demands that the Bf-109 made of its pilot in the critical seconds between the throttle going forward and the wheels leaving the ground. This was not exciting intelligence. It was not a discovery that would change tactical doctrine, but it spoke to something important about the aircraft's design philosophy, which was that a fighter that was easier to fly safely on the ground would lose fewer pilots to accidents, and pilots lost to accidents were as dead as pilots lost to enemy fire and could not be replaced any faster. Once airborne and climbing, Erler began to explore the aircraft's performance envelope, and the performance envelope was where the P-51 revealed its most significant characteristics. The climb rate was adequate without being exceptional. The Bf-109G climbed faster, and the FW-190A climbed faster still. A German pilot who needed to gain altitude quickly to escape or to position himself for a diving attack had, in raw climb performance, a theoretical advantage over a P-51 pilot at comparable power settings. Erler noted this. His superiors would note it. It would become part of the tactical guidance distributed to Luftwaffe fighter units explaining how to handle engagements with Mustangs. But climb rate was only one number, and one number does not describe an aircraft any more than one measurement describes a man. At altitude above 25,000 feet, where the long-range escort missions were flown, the P-51's supercharger maintained power in a way that the Bf-109's engine could not match with the same consistency. The Merlin's two-speed, two-stage supercharger had been designed specifically for high-altitude performance, and the result was an aircraft that arrived at the target with power to spare after a journey that had taken it through altitude bands that degraded the performance of every German fighter that might be waiting for it. The speed at altitude was the number that made the Luftwaffe's tactical problem concrete. The P-51D could exceed 430 miles per hour at operational altitude. The Bf-109G could reach approximately 385 miles per hour under comparable conditions. The gap was not enormous in absolute terms. 45 miles per hour at high altitude translated into a tactical reality with significant implications. A P-51 pilot who did not want to engage could simply leave. A German pilot who wanted to disengage from an unfavorable engagement could not simply run faster and open the distance. The decision about whether a fight continued or ended belonged, in most circumstances, to the American. Ehrler tested the controls at high speed. This was where the P-51's aerodynamic design produced its most important characteristic, the one that the German pilots encountering it in combat had noticed and reported, and that the Luftwaffe technical staff had partially understood but not fully communicated to the pilots who needed to know it. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, the P-51 remained responsive. The ailerons moved with reasonable force and produced the roll rates that a pilot needed to maneuver aggressively. At comparable speeds, the Bf-109's ailerons became heavy. The forces required to move them increased with airspeed in a way that limited the pilot's ability to roll quickly, and the inability to roll quickly at high speed was a significant tactical limitation in the diving attacks and high-speed maneuvering that characterized the air combat of 1944. The P-51's laminar flow wing, the aerodynamic innovation that North Americans engineers had incorporated from research conducted by the American National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was responsible for this characteristic and for another that was even more consequential at the extreme high speeds of combat diving. The critical Mach number, the speed at which compressibility effects began to degrade an aircraft's handling, was higher for the P-51 than for any other fighter then in service on either side. In a steep dive at high altitude, where both aircraft were building speed toward the region where air began to behave in ways that classical aerodynamics did not fully describe, the P-51 remained controllable at speeds that caused the Bf-109 to experience buffeting, loss of elevator effectiveness, and potentially dangerous structural loads. The P-51 pilot could push deeper into the dive and pull out lower, using energy that his opponent could not safely follow him to. This was not theoretical. It was being demonstrated in the skies over Germany every time a formation of P-51s encountered a formation of German fighters and the engagement moved into the high-speed maneuvering that escort combat regularly produced. German pilots who had tried to follow P-51s in diving escapes had sometimes discovered the limits of their own aircraft's compressibility margin in ways that were not survivable. Ehrler flew for 2 hours. He tested the turn performance, which was competitive with the Bf-109 at medium speeds and inferior at low speeds, where the German aircraft's automatic leading-edge slats gave it an advantage in slow-speed maneuvering. He tested the stability in all axes, which was good, better than the Bf-109 in several respects, reflecting the different design priorities of an aircraft intended for long missions over hostile territory rather than short scrambles from defended airfields. He tested the weapon system, 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, with enough ammunition for approximately 18 seconds of concentrated fire, which was more than adequate for an aircraft that was expected to be accurate and was designed with the harmonization to support accuracy at the ranges where most successful kills occurred. Then he flew home and wrote his report. The report that Ehrler and other experienced pilots produced for the Luftwaffe High Command contained technical data that the engineers and planners expected: performance figures, handling characteristics, comparisons with German aircraft in specific flight regimes, recommendations for tactical approaches that minimized the P-51's advantages. This was the information the High Command had asked for and the information it received. But the report also contained something the High Command had not asked for and found more troubling than any performance figure. It contained an honest assessment of what the P-51 represented as a strategic instrument, and that assessment was devastating. The P-51 was not the fastest fighter in the sky over Germany in 1944. It was not the most maneuverable. It did not have the most powerful armament. German pilots who caught it in the right circumstances, at the right altitude, at low speed, with surprise, could defeat it. German aces did defeat it in significant numbers throughout the year. But the P-51 could do something that no German fighter could do and that no previous Allied fighter had been able to do. It could fly from England to Berlin and back. With external fuel tanks that were jettisoned when combat began, it carried enough internal fuel to escort heavy bombers to any target in Germany and return to base. The escorts were no longer turning back at the German frontier. They were arriving over the Reich with fuel for 30 minutes of combat and returning home. This was not a tactical problem. It was a strategic catastrophe. The Luftwaffe's response to the American bombing campaign had been built on an assumption that had proven to be temporarily but genuinely valid. The bombers would eventually outrun their escorts, and unescorted bombers were vulnerable to a degree that made deep penetration raids prohibitively costly. Black Thursday had seemed to confirm this. If the Americans could be forced to continue sending unescorted bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe's fighter force could bleed the bombing campaign to death. The P-51 eliminated that assumption. The escorts would not outrun their fighters. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait at the German border for the Americans to arrive without protection. The Americans would arrive with protection, and the protection was an aircraft that could fly further at comparable speed with better high-altitude performance, and that was arriving in numbers that reflected the productive capacity of a nation that had not been bombed. The production numbers were the part of the assessment that sat most heavily on the men who read Ehrler's report and understood its implications fully. North American aviation had built approximately 9,000 P-51 Mustangs by the end of 1944. The production rate through the year had exceeded 100 aircraft per week at peak. Each aircraft was built to tolerances that American industrial capacity, undamaged by bombing and operating with the full resources of the world's largest economy, could maintain consistently. Each aircraft that was lost in combat or accident was replaced by an aircraft that was functionally identical, maintained to the same standard, flown by a pilot who had received more flight training hours than the German replacement pilot who would oppose him. Germany was producing aircraft in comparable numbers through much of 1944, which was itself a remarkable industrial achievement given the bombing campaign targeting its factories. But the aircraft it was producing were being flown by pilots with diminishing experience, maintained by ground crews working with diminishing supplies, and operating from airfields that were under attack with increasing frequency as the P-51s received new orders from the 8th Air Force's new commander. General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January of 1944, made a decision that altered the character of the air war over Germany immediately and permanently. He released the escort fighters from the close escort role. Instead of flying tight formation with the bombers, the P-51s were authorized to range ahead of the bomber stream, seek out German fighters, and destroy them wherever they were found. On the ground, in the air, over their own airfields, climbing to altitude to intercept, landing to refuel. At any point in their operational cycle where they were vulnerable. This was not escort duty. This was a campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, using the P-51's range and performance to bring the fight to the German fighters on their own territory and sustain that fight through an attrition that American production could replace and German production increasingly could not. The pilots who bore the cost of this campaign were the ones whose names appeared in the operational record of the Luftwaffe's fighter wings through the spring and summer of 1944. Men with 50 victories, 100 victories, men who had survived 3 years of the most intense aerial combat in history were dying in numbers that the replacement pipeline could not match with comparable experience. A pilot with 150 hours of flight time, which was the average for Luftwaffe fighter pilots entering combat by mid-1944, was not the same as a pilot with 1,000 hours and 100 victories. He could fly the aircraft. He could not fly it at the level required to survive against P-51 pilots who had 400 hours and were flying an aircraft that forgave mistakes more readily than the Bf-109. Major Anton Haeckel, who commanded a fighter wing in the defense of the Reich during this period, described what the loss of experienced pilots meant in practice. His unit received replacements who had never fired their guns at another aircraft in training, who had been pushed through abbreviated courses because the front needed men more urgently than the training establishments could provide them, who arrived at operational units and were often dead within a week. The experienced pilots who remained spent their time not fighting, because fighting meant exposure, but trying to survive long enough to teach the replacements something useful, which was almost impossible given the attrition rate. Haeckel's description is consistent with the testimony of every senior Luftwaffe officer who has spoken about this period. The crisis was not material. Germany was producing aircraft. The crisis was human. The experienced pilots who had built the Luftwaffe's fighting capability through years of combat were being killed faster than years of training could replace them, and the P-51 was the instrument of that replacement rate. Erler himself understood this. He had survived experiences that had killed most of the men he had known at the beginning of the war. He had the experience to assess the P-51 accurately and the honesty to report what he found rather than what his superiors might have preferred to hear. His report told them that the P-51 was a very good aircraft, well suited to the mission it was being used for, representing industrial and engineering practices that German production could not match under current conditions. His superiors read the report. They distributed the tactical recommendations. They continued fighting the war with the aircraft and the pilots they had against an opponent that had more of both and was building more of both every month. Erler continued flying. He was one of the most experienced and effective fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, and he was assigned to the defense of the Reich in the final year of the war because the Reich's defenders needed experienced pilots more than any other theater. He flew against bombers. He flew against their escorts. He flew in conditions of numerical inferiority that his training and experience allowed him to manage more effectively than the replacements around him could. He was killed on April 4th, 1945, 34 days before the German surrender. The circumstances were the ones that the P-51's range and the Doolittle Directive had made routine. American fighters ranging over Germany, engaging whatever they found, operating with fuel and numbers that reflected the productive capacity behind them. Erler was among the targets they found that day. He was 31 years old. He had 208 confirmed aerial victories. He had been awarded some of the highest decorations the German military could bestow. He had flown the aircraft that defeated his country and written an honest assessment of why it would do so. He died in the war that assessment described, which is a kind of coherence, if not a consolation. The P-51 Mustang outlasted the war. It flew in Korea, where propeller-driven aircraft made their last significant combat appearances in American service before jets made them obsolete for frontline use. It flew with the air forces of nations that received it through military assistance programs long after the Second World War had ended. Individual aircraft are still flying today, maintained by owners who understand that they are operating something that represents a specific moment in engineering and industrial history, the moment when American productive capacity and aerodynamic innovation combined to produce an instrument that changed the strategic situation of a world war. The thing that Earler noticed in that cockpit in the spring of 1944 was not the speed or the armament or any single performance figure. It was the totality of the aircraft, the accumulated evidence of what was possible when unlimited industrial capacity was directed toward a specific problem by engineers who had the time and the resources to solve it correctly. The clean engine, the reliable starter, the spacious cockpit designed for pilots who would sit in it for 7 hours. The laminar flow wing developed from years of aerodynamic research. The bubble canopy that let the pilot see everything around him. None of these things was accidental. All of them reflected choices made by a nation that could make those choices because it had not been bombed and had not been invaded, and had not spent 4 years consuming its industrial capacity in a war that was progressively destroying the conditions necessary to sustain industrial production. The P-51 was not just an aircraft. It was a measurement of the distance between what Germany could produce in 1944 and what America could produce in 1944. The distance was the answer to the question of who was going to win. Earler had measured that distance from inside the cockpit and reported what he found. His superiors understood what his report meant. Understanding it and doing anything about it were different problems entirely. If this analysis gave you a fuller picture of what the P-51 Mustang meant to the pilots who flew it and the pilots who fought against it, please like and subscribe. The men who flew these aircraft on both sides understood something about the war that statistics alone cannot convey. Thank you for watching.